Good.
All right. Good evening and welcome to the December 17th, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. Tonight, the Planning Commission is a little bit different than our normal Planning Commission standards. We are in a study session tonight, and as such, the Planning Commission will not be taking public comment and will not be making any decisions tonight. So therefore, we won't go through the kind of standard protocol of a phone call and that, as public comment will be taken in any public hearing later on either of these subjects. However, before we start tonight and get into business, I'd like everybody to stand to say the Pledge of Allegiance, if you can. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right. Before we get started tonight as well, I'd like to make sure we establish a quorum. So Planning Commission members, as I call out your name, please answer aye. Commissioner Goldsman is gone tonight. We know that. Commissioner Corman.
Aye.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
And Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
All right, and that is 6 of us here tonight. The quorum is established. And our first study item tonight is to discuss the temporary pandemic housing. And Julie Farnham, you have the staff report for us.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the commission, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And you can see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Then we're good to go. I'm Julie Farnham, senior planner. With me tonight, obviously, is Glenn Markegard, planning manager, as well as Megan Rogers from our legal department. So we'll be going through this. I'll be going through it, and they're available for questions. Now, if I could figure out how to advance my screen. Oh, dear. There we go. So I just want to start by saying, you've been considering this item or things related to this item for the last month and a half or so. So as we get started, I wanted to give a little bit of background of where we're at. So we're really trying, what is the purpose of addressing this temporary pandemic housing? It really is to respond to this current issue that's going on that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and that is the unsheltered homelessness. City has been working with multiple government and nonprofit agencies to address this issue, both in Bloomington as well as throughout the county, because it's not a Bloomington specific issue. And really, we've been focusing fairly narrowly on addressing this situation and really focusing on how best to regulate this temporary use that's currently occurring in hotels. We know that homelessness is a big and a concerning issue, and that's really kind of a longer term issue to address, and the interim use or any other approach that we might take with regard to the pandemic housing is really not something that can address the bigger issues related to homelessness, and that is not the intent. I would say with regard to the homeless permanent issue or larger issue, currently permanent shelters are allowed via a CUP, that's the congregate housing facilities. And moving forward, the city will be involved in addressing this bigger issue. Again, it goes well beyond just looking at a zoning fix, and we'll be collaborating with our partners and in other governmental agencies as well as the nonprofit agencies to address the broader issue of homelessness. Also thought it would be helpful to just kind of run through a little chronology of how did we get here. So again, the city has been dealing with the issue of hotels being used to shelter some homeless people for the last 6+ months. A few months back, the county, Hennepin County, approached the city about purchasing a hotel and converting it to a shelter. That really triggered the creation of this IUP ordinance as a way to address that specific request. The county withdrew their request because they decided not to purchase that property. At that point in time, that literally happened right before the ordinance was scheduled to go for public hearing in front of the Planning Commission on November 5th. We had the ordinance drafted. We felt it was best to just proceed with that. The ordinance was drafted very specifically to accommodate the hotels, I'm sorry, the county's request. So it was a little bit challenging to apply it more broadly than that. And we had public hearings, both at Planning Commission and City Council on that original ordinance in November. And the action that happened was that the original ordinance, just a portion of that was moved forward for adoption. And that did get adopted by City Council on November 23rd. And at the last Planning Commission meeting, you directed staff to draft an ordinance that focused in on the interim use permit and the standards. So through those meetings with the Planning Commission, several issues came to light, and they're kind of summarized here. Planning Commission felt that the IUP ordinance as written was too restrictive. You were looking for something that could be more flexible to respond to this immediate need. So one of the ideas was to expand where it could be allowed, to allow it in more zoning districts than originally intended. Also to look at controlling it via some criteria other than just zoning districts. So proximity to support services, namely transit, grocery stores, and pharmacies. It was also brought up, there were concerns raised about just the process itself to go through and get an IUP, and also just to get an IUP ordinance drafted and adopted. And once that would happen, if somebody came in, they would have to apply to get an IUP. That whole review process from application to getting it through City Council approval is about 7 to 8 weeks. And so there was concerns raised that really was not very nimble for responding to what is a fairly urgent need. In addition, some of the application requirements, there's fees involved, et cetera, could in themselves become a barrier or a deterrent to somebody actually seeking out this process. So taking those concerns into consideration, staff, after the last Planning Commission meeting, we kind of stepped back a little bit and thought about, what would be the best way to address these issues, address the issue of the temporary housing need, but also the issues brought up by the Planning Commission. And we looked to another process that was used for other kind of emergency related, addressing some things like patios and outdoor dining. And so we looked at creating a process that was much more streamlined. So that's what we're calling this, the emergency authorized staff review process. So it's really a permitting process that is less formalized and cumbersome than an actual IUP. So tonight we're going to kind of compare these two different processes and get your input on and some direction from you on that. The other piece is the standards, and we've discussed these standards with you primarily back on November 19th. These standards pretty much apply to either one of these processes. So we'll also go through those. So first, a comparison here of the two processes. So in terms of how quickly can we get the either the IUP ordinance or the resolution to allow this emergency permitting process in place. We're looking at February to get it to City Council. because we're looking at January 14th for Planning Commission public hearing on the IUP, and then that would go to City Council in February. With the emergency approach, we would draft, it's essentially a resolution that would go as soon as we could get it onto a City Council agenda in January. So, you know, we view that process as being the more nimble of the two. Similarly, with the review process, as I just mentioned, the IUP, you know, you go through the application, it gets internally reviewed, goes through public hearings at Planning Commission and City Council, and that overall is about a 7 to 8 week process. With the emergency approach, they would submit their application request with the required information, and that would be reviewed internally by staff, and staff can turn that around in about a week. With regard to decision authority, interim use, again, has to go through public hearings at both Planning Commission and City Council. The emergency approach is a staff authorized review and approval. With regard to public input opportunities, primarily on the IUP, that's through the public hearing process. With the emergency approach, there isn't a formal public review process. With regard to enforcement, it's essentially the same between the two processes. I'm going to go over the standards now. So they're essentially the same. Again, for the two processes, there's two things that are different and would only apply to new shelters. And that is the locational criteria and the requirement that no unrelated use would be allowed on the site. And the reason these would only apply to the new ones is because this was one of the things we heard back from some of the existing shelter providers, is that they couldn't really meet some of those proposed criteria for location and also with the unrelated use on site. So all of the other standards, so security, management, building and site requirements, inspections, those would all apply to either approach. So with regard to the locational criteria, this is what was talked about quite a bit on November 19th, and Planning Commission kind of landed on two primary criteria, and that was the proximity to transit station. And so what we're showing here is 1/4 mile to a transit station. That's kind of your typical station area radius. And then a 1/2 mile to a full service grocery or a pharmacy. And so that's what you're seeing here on the screen. We would also prohibit the use within the runway protection zone. Residential uses are not allowed in those areas already. And we see this shelter uses as something that's more residential. And so we would not allow it there, and also would prohibit it in the lower density residential districts. Here is a comparison of the standards between these two approaches. Like I just went through, the locational criteria is essentially the same. Under the emergency approach, it would only apply to new shelters that came into, that somebody who requested one after this resolution, if this resolution were, if that's the approach, once that's adopted, that would be the approach, but it would not be required of the existing shelters. With the interim use permit, obviously anyone that comes in for an interim use permit would be after that ordinance would be adopted. All of the other standards are the same except for duration. So again, we talked about this at the last Planning Commission meeting about the original proposal was to have duration be 2 years across the board. Planning Commission wanted some flexibility there. And so what is now we're looking at here is having the 2 years be in the residential, the multifamily residential districts, and allowing a 1 year duration in all other zoning districts. The emergency approach would only be in effect it's tied to an emergency order. There would be a phase out period though, because an emergency order can be lifted and the use, that would be too abrupt to end the use. So there would need to be a phase out period, but it would be essentially tied to an emergency order. So with that, we get to some of the questions for input from the Planning Commission. So first up is with regard to the process. Staff is recommending the emergency approach because we really feel that best meets the need, the current need that's out there, and it also addresses the concerns that the Planning Commission has brought up so far. So that would be our recommendation. And so our question to you is whether or not you agree with that, or if you would rather proceed with the interim use approach. So with that, I will stop and open it up for discussion.
All right, thank you. Commission members, do you have any questions for Julie on this? Or thoughts? I'll start real quick. Just the one question, Julie, and I wanted to make sure that I'm not mishearing something. And so in regard to the IUP versus emergency options, are existing facilities that are out there grandfathered in at this point, or would existing facilities have to come back for an IUP?
Mr. Chair, our discussion, we had this discussion a little bit on the 19th, November 19th, and I believe the response from the attorney was that we would be looking to have the existing shelters come back and go through the IUP process. But maybe just to be more clear on that, I would turn that over to Megan Rogers, and she can either affirm what I just said or clarify for you.
Okay, Megan, are you able? There we go.
Yes, absolutely. So the emergency approach would be available to the existing shelters as well as potentially any new providers that would come in. The variation would be between the standards for any new facility would meet all of the standards rather than whereas with the existing providers, we're meeting them where they are. But then also memorializing the security protocols and those other issues that were of particular importance to the city. So the flexibility of the process remains for all facilities for use during the period of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, I think I understand that. So essentially, the new criteria would be for new facilities. Otherwise, they would provide all the other criteria that was standardized. Okay, thank you. Any other questions for staff? Commissioner Roman?
Thank you. I guess we're in study mode, so I guess I don't know how formal you want us to be in study mode.
Yeah, I think just to try and make sure everybody, as they're listening in, they can hear who's talking.
Yeah, that's fine. To the staff question, I agree with their recommendation on the emergency authorized review for the reasons of timeliness. And I think if the criteria are clear, and I think this group has been pretty consistent on agreeing with the staff, the city's recommendations on enforcement and the things that we need to have to be able to do that safely. And so I think we've made that clear. So if those boundaries are in place, I'm comfortable with the staff approval on this.
Okay. Other commissioners' thoughts? Commissioner Albrecht?
Yeah, I would agree with Commissioner Roman on that. I think just looking at the timeline, I can't remember exactly what Julie's presentation said, but between 7 and 8 weeks and under a week makes a lot of sense given how quickly we've seen things change in our current situation. So I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Abdi?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate staff's recommendation and the comparison between the two, the new idea and the
the interim use. The question I had, and I know it was brought up at the previous meetings, was can facilities go back to their old ways once the emergency ends? I don't know. Right now, I think as part of the presentation, you mentioned that a different use cannot concurrently occur while the use is the facility is being used for emergency housing. I know we've had back and forth discussions about facilities likely not being able to go back. Is that clear? Is that no longer a requirement? I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Abdi, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the very original ordinance that we looked at back on November 5th was recommending that the properties had to be rezoned to multifamily, RM50. And thus returning back to the original hotel use, for instance, would probably be a challenge because number one, the hotel wouldn't have been allowed in the new zoning district. So it was like the requirement was to rezone in order to do the shelter. But then if you wanted to return back to being a hotel, you'd have to rezone back to the original zoning. And so that was seen as being very cumbersome. So in the situation right now, either with the IUP or with the emergency approach, yes, they could return back to, there's no rezoning needed. So the original use, they could return back to the original use. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you for the clarification.
All right. Any further questions there, Commissioner Abdi? Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right. Commissioner Cook then?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a little torn between both options because there are aspects of each that I like. Certainly with the emergency approach, I like the idea that we can move very quickly and take care of this much faster than with the IUP process. But I'm a little torn on that because although 6 weeks is a long time in the short term, in the long term, when we're talking about a pandemic that's been going on for the better part of a year now, we're probably still going to be in this for a number of months, 6 weeks becomes a little bit less consequential. And there are things about the IUP process that I like. There are really three things I have jotted down here that I like better about the IUP process than the emergency process. The first being that the IUP process gives the City Council more flexibility as to when that end date is. One thing we talked about was that we need to be careful about when we terminate this type of usage because of kids in school and families, and that can be really difficult. And when we have the flexibility to terminate this usage over a summer break or even a winter break or something to help families out, I think there's a big benefit there. So that's important to me. The second thing is I'm not wild about not having public comments with the emergency approach. I think this is a big deal for residents of the city. We've heard that. We've heard that from business owners. We've heard it from residents. It was getting a lot of traction when the initial application was looking like it was going to come before us. I want the public, it would be my preference to have the public involved and allow them to provide comments when one of these applications comes before us. And the final thing I have written down here is I'm not wild that it doesn't come before the Planning Commission, not for my own selfish reason, but I really respect the view of my fellow commissioners. I think we have a lot of people on this commission that care a lot, that study a lot, that put a lot of time into these applications, and I really value their opinion. And I think that my fellow commissioners make a real difference on these types of applications and guiding us to making sure that we're doing the right thing for our residents. And so for all three of those reasons, I prefer the IUP process.
Thank you. Commissioner Abdi, do you have your hand back up or?
Yes, I do, Mr.
Okay,
Chair.
go ahead.
I think just hearing what Commissioner Cook mentioned, for staff, would there be an appeal option? Is there an appeal opportunity for the authorized staff review process? Because the other option would have had an appeal option like any public hearing does, just for clarification.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Commissioner Abdi, I am going to ask Megan Rogers to respond to that. The, you know, this is still kind of a work in progress, so I guess I'll have her speak to how that, from a legal standpoint, how that might or might not be possible.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I think that an appeal process certainly could be worked into the permitting approach, so that if staff found that a property was non-compliant with the set standards that you've advised on, if the City Council would ultimately determine that there could be an appeal to a city body, that certainly could be part of the process. And I think ultimately, what is similar about both of the approaches, both the IUP approach and the emergency approach, is that the standards are identical in both processes. It's just which powers the city is utilizing and the sort of permanency of those powers. And so they very much, they mirror each other in many ways, and the standards are going to be at the core of your advice and counsel on this matter in both processes.
Commissioner Abdi, anything further?
I think I heard an answer that I think I would like to hear. I appreciate staff's, I know this is a work in progress. So I know you guys are thinking on your feet as we ask these questions right now. But so then from what I heard, then the simple answer would be yes, if staff were to review and approve an application that they did not like, how would they know about it? Because there would not be a public hearing for them to appeal on. And two, would that, maybe just focusing on number one, how would they know about it for them to say, I can appeal this, I don't like this?
So I think I approached your question from the opposite side. So what I was thinking about is that an applicant comes in and they don't meet the standards that have been set by the Planning Commission and Council, and therefore staff rejects the application, and then they would be entitled to an appeal. That is a simple process that we certainly could incorporate into the permit application. I think that your question is a really good one, and is a more complicated process in terms of a public appeal for a use. And I think the issue that really is presented in these cases is that we have ongoing uses that are not in compliance with our existing zoning code. And we're trying to craft just in the very name of the IUP, right? Interim or temporary approaches to be able to solve these sort of complex and springing problems. So I think in terms of a member of the public appealing the permit decision of the planning manager or the planning review team, that would be difficult to incorporate. But something that is definitely in place is that any member of the public would have the ability to speak with the city or file a complaint about any violations of the standards. So things, like, and something that has been consistent across the city's approach to this is that we have continued to enforce those very important public health, safety, and welfare issues. So ensuring that people in the hotel are being well served by the facility, and that people in the surrounding neighborhoods are also being well served as the hotels being good neighbors. So there is that complaint process that also could be utilized.
And I'm just going to jump in also to say that another one of the standards is inspections, and this again applies to either. So the emergency permit or the IUP allows for the city, the issuing authority, to routinely inspect the premises to make sure that they are complying with all those other standards, the security plan, the management operations, the building and site requirements. So there is that ability as well. So there's some oversight.
Thank you. Commissioner Abney, it looks like you still have some more questions.
Final one, I promise. Because this, if we, and I am leaning more toward the staff approval personally. If the staff approval and you figure out the appeal process for the public, is there going to be a public record or a map or something on the city's website that shows where these types of facilities or uses are popping up throughout the city for anybody interested to see where an emergency housing is at, if there's one nearby their area, so that they're informed of where this use is at throughout the city?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Abdi, we haven't talked about that. I guess I don't know that there would be any reason why we couldn't do that. But once again, I would ask our attorney if there is any legal reason why having a map that showed where these permits were issued would have, if there were any legal issues with that.
I don't believe there would be any legal issues with that, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. One of the things that we already have available as a resource is that our CityBiz GIS site allows you to, as a member of the public, to come into the city's website and then click to see ongoing applications in your neighborhood. And so that's a mechanism that already exists. And I'm sure that we could find, we could create a page that would direct folks to look at those things, and they could see all of the application information. That would be there may be some information in terms of the security plans that is protected private information. But aside from that and redacted from that, those documents are public and they're already part of our existing public process.
And Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Commissioner Abdi, we also have a development map that's set up to kind of show the public where all the future and coming development is at. So we could easily add it to that web page as well.
That could be a layer.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions on that, Commissioner Abdi?
No, Mr. Chair, I appreciate staff's comments.
Yep. All right. Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No questions, just to say thank you, and that my preference is the emergency one. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have just a couple questions, and it really has to do maybe with if we can think about establishing it. And I think what you're hearing is across the board. I'm hearing support for establishing it. There might be a slight difference in which one moving forward, but thinking about the end, and Julie, if you can go back a slide, I think you had that kind of comparison or something at the termination, only periods covered in emergency orders. Just to clarify some of that, emergency orders by the governor or emergency orders by the staff or by the city?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And once again, I'm going to rely on our legal staff here to maybe flesh that out a little bit, if you could, Megan.
Yes, Mr. Chair, what we contemplate here is expiration of the governor's emergency order. And concurrently with the expiration of the governor's emergency order, the expiration of the eviction moratorium as well.
Okay, all right. And then I'm going to just kind of continue down this just to make sure I fully understand. So the emergency authorized staff review is during that emergency order to be able to review and approve those. Is the IUP, would that last beyond any emergency order? So say the emergency order stops next week, and certainly I think we're all probably aware of the unemployment. We're aware of the fact that many people's housing has been, they have not been able to be evicted for several months, but now some of that may have built up. So if that order were to end tomorrow, for instance, can they still apply for an interim use permit on properties, or is that only during the emergency order as well?
Mr. Chair, the interim use permit was not tied to the emergency order. And the timing of it would extend potentially up, beyond the end of an emergency order. It would be, the timing of it would be whatever is approved on the interim use permit. So the 2 years and the 1 year is, as drafted, is a maximum amount. Depending on what got approved, if council approved it for the full 2 years or the full 1 year or something less than that, that is the extent of the duration of the interim use permit. So it's kind of outside of the emergency orders.
Okay, so then I'm going to kind of continue down this a little bit. A facility comes in and applies under, and let's say we allow the emergency authorized staff review to move forward with those, to move forward for a shorter period. Why couldn't we also do an IUP as another option for them to have that longer period, maybe after an emergency authorization is dropped? So thinking about, they need to meet the standards, they do the emergency authorization, that order ends, we have a phase out period, maybe that's during the summer, as I think some of the planning commission members have alluded to, so kids aren't disrupted from school. But those areas continue, could the city think about then an interim use permit to allow that kind of, because I don't think homelessness goes away overnight. And so just trying to think about that a little bit.
Sure, Mr. Chair. Just kind of circle back to some of my comments right at the beginning of this presentation, how this interim use permit is really not intended as a solution to the longer term homelessness problem. And by definition, it is related to a pandemic. Mm-hmm. Even though the duration would go beyond, potentially beyond an executive or an emergency order. And the other thing that I want to point out, one of the things that staff was struggling with here, and some of the planning commissioners brought it up at the last meeting, was, by the time, you get around to getting an interim use permit, how much longer is this going to last? Because if you're having to create this shelter use and do all the things that you have to do, how long is that going to, what's really the demand for doing this? I mean, we've got demand right now, and that I think is part of where, we wanted to try to come up with an approach that could address the current need more effectively, because we had some concerns, and so did some planning commissioners, about whether or not there would be a lot of push or demand for somebody to actually come in and do an interim use permit to convert their property, their entire property, to a shelter use for the duration of the permit, especially if this kind of emergency situation starts to wane. Because one of the things that was driving this was the need to de-densify, I guess, some of the traditional shelters. So, when the emergency or when the pandemic gets under better control, that situation could change. So that was also kind of in the back of our minds a little bit. So, but you're right that the duration under the IUP is potentially longer. I mean, we don't know how long this emergency will last. It could last for the next year as well.
Okay, thank you. And just really what I'm trying to understand is how these might end, or what those next phases are. And so I think, to your point, the IUP gives that maybe potentially longer flexibility. But then we still also have the congregate housing ordinance, and I just want to understand just a little bit as we think about this and what we've given you guys as staff over the past month of ideas for thinking about this. Congregate housing is only in which zoning districts? And maybe I'll ask Mr. Markegard or
Sure.
to kind of help on that, so we understand maybe what that next phase is potentially if something wanted to convert more permanently.
Sure. So, Mr. Chairman, congregate living facilities are currently conditional uses in all of the multifamily zoning districts in the city. So, a more traditional permanent shelter, in the past or in the future, would go through that conditional use permit process within those districts.
Okay, so, and those districts being the RM24 and up?
RM12, R4, and then RM24 and up from there.
Okay, so theoretically, applicant, if, and I know we talked about this just as potentials, but would a entity want to then rezone, and that would be that more permanent decision. So I'm in a good spot with that, and I appreciate staff's response to the questions for that. So, and then I think just one other question is talking about the phase-out period. I think we've given some feedback on that before. That certainly, and I see Megan kind of responding here that we have, but making sure that we're really thinking about families in this and what, I mean, boy, the pandemic's stressful enough, let alone having to move your family. So thinking about that for potential, not necessarily a time frame, but maybe connected to an action. With that, I am generally in support of the emergency authorized staff review, knowing that we've done a lot of discussion. We've had a lot of discussion on this. I think we're really trying to respond to the environment around us with not only the pandemic, but housing crisis and unemployment. And so I could support that as it is, as long as we're thinking about that duration with families in mind. Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know if this, it's not a question directly related to the standards, but really in relation to the families. And as this plan moves forward, if the city has, or if you have already considered a partnership with the school district, or if this is something that will be coming along as the process continues, because I think it's important to identify it also, especially those families or students who are in desperate need for a more stable home situation.
Thank you. Commissioner Roman?
Yeah, I wanted to touch a little bit on the comment that Commissioner Cookton made about public input, and I think that's an important. It's often an important piece of why we do our things the way we do them, and we have these public meetings. I worry about in this specific situation, and we heard some public feedback last time about distance, about density, about things that can have a compound impact. What I worry about is I don't want to have something where the public comment is just a constant stream of this is icky, because I think that's just not helpful, and it's not. I mean, it's not based in anyone's individual experience. Very few people's individual experience. I should say nobody living near a facility like this, and because if it was a permanent thing, if we were looking to convert something long term, then I think that has a long term impact on people's businesses, people's homes, whatever that may be that's in proximity. A person that's more of a short-term use, we've had a few things where we've had some things come back to us, and we hear kind of the same stuff about it's just, I don't know. I think people know kind of some of the things that we've had in front of us, that it's less about the use and more about the discomfort with something that's different. And I don't want us to open that up either, because being uncomfortable with something that's different is not the same as again, a permanent use that may cause an impact to your business or your home. So that's part of the reason I lean more toward the staff side too. But I wanted to acknowledge that I agree with Commissioner Cookton on the important part about public feedback on the business of this body, which is partly why I think it maybe wouldn't be best served in this body.
Okay. Other commissioners, other thoughts? I'll talk a little bit thinking about the kind of the public notice side, and I think one of the key points for me is tied to governor's emergency and emergency authorization, and we're talking about temporary pandemic housing. So it's a very limited scope to, and especially as we think about this now in the state of Minnesota and what the temperatures are going to start to do here very shortly. We've been very lucky up to this point. Yes, it could extend to a longer period, but I do think there are extenuating circumstances to that side of the house to say there's reasons to do things in a very quick manner. And I do think on the other side, we have the ability to notify public, albeit through the application side and the development mapping. But it does come back to, I really think that this is something we're allowing on a very limited basis in the city. And once it goes to maybe a more permanent application, that's really the opportunity for residents and neighbors to think about how is that impact and what are their comments for the city to view and understand. So Commissioner Roman, do you have another comment?
It did, and staff, if this is in the next question you had teed up for us, I can wait. But the phase out period, is that intended to be consistent, or is that intended to be variable based on each individual applicant?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman, actually that's a kind of a good segue too into talking about some of these standards. Again, this is kind of a work in progress, and I hate to keep throwing everything over to Megan, but she's the one who's been closest to, she's been sort of the person in the middle of all the different comments that have been coming in on this work in progress. So I'm going to ask her to maybe spell out what is the latest thinking on that phase out period. Or have we just, are we still at such the early stage that we're open to just some input?
Thank you, Julie. Mr. Chair, members of the commission. I think that the phase out process, we are seeking input from the existing providers. And I think it will be essential for them to assist us with crafting that language, because they are in the best position to know what their transition period will look like. And I think that it will likely vary based upon each one of the providers and the specific type of resources that are available to those providers. For example, the Hennepin County has worked diligently over the last several months to develop new housing opportunities, and is putting up about 400 units over the this month and then next month for people to have a more permanent place. And in doing so, we'll be transitioning people out of existing facilities in the city of Bloomington. And so I think that's a good example of how, when other needs are met in this larger scope of trying to address the homelessness issue in the metro area and statewide, that it's going to be dependent upon the particular group served, the existing resources of the provider, and the availability and sort of their plan for the people that they serve. And so I would, it's a very long way of saying I think it will be scaled on a provider-based approach.
Okay, I think I would encourage staff to think about some sort of, I don't know what that is, but some sort of parameter that it may be flexible by parameter, but it should not be longer than X. And it goes back to the previous conversation we had about which route do we go.
Mm-hmm.
IUP versus, I'll call it EASR for short. And I think, again, people knowing that, okay, we're going to go this route, and it's expect people, the public, knowing that it's not going to last longer than X past Y. Again, get that there may be individual needs, but I think it would be helpful for people to, so if staff is chewing on this, phase out not longer than whatever time period that is, and the public, and we can react to that when you have thoughts on that.
Other thoughts? You know, Commissioner Roman, I think it's a good point. There does need to be something, and I think where we're at now and what we're thinking about, and I'm coming from the side of having kids in that, but there are certainly individuals and programs that are going to treat things differently. So I think that makes sense. That the providers will help with that, and I think that's the other side, though, is from providers. I think, do we have a responsibility to also then try and protect those kids that might be in school already in Bloomington or Richfield, and try and keep them settled? So, any other thoughts? Well, let me ask this to staff. Do you need any more on that particular interim versus emergency authorized?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just for the record, what I'm hearing is a clear consensus on the emergency approach in terms of process, and then we'll talk about standards next.
Okay.
Is that correct?
I believe so. I did hear that Commissioner Cookdon was a little more on the interim use side because of the public comment. Is that correct, Commissioner Cookdon?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I do prefer the IUP.
Okay, but I understand all the other commissioners to be on the emergency authorized staff review.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair and Commissioners, so the other question was about the standards. And so I think I'll just stay on this screen because it lays everything out. And we've kind of had this discussion about the duration already because all the other standards are the same. But in your packet, you also got a draft that spells out the standards, like the requirements and security plan, et cetera, in much more detail. Probably the one that we're, well, if you have any comments on any of those, but the other one is the question of the locational criteria. If you are comfortable with that. So we're looking at a 1/4 mile or potentially a 1/2 mile from a transit stop and a 1/2 mile from grocery or pharmacy. So if you concur with, I guess we're looking for your direction on if you're good with the 1/2 mile, the 1/4 mile, 1/2 mile, or you prefer a 1/2 mile, 1/2 mile, or if you don't think any of those standards should be included. So just looking for your kind of concurrence or suggestions on the standards as currently drafted.
Sure, thank you. I certainly open this up to everybody. I think from my perspective, I think our standard distance for walking, we consider a 1/2 mile. So I'm not sure why we would have difference for grocery and pharmacy versus a transit stop. Thinking it might actually be harder to walk with groceries than potentially be riding the bus to go to a job or something. So I'll open this up to commission members. Commissioner Roman.
Yeah, I would agree with John about the 1/2 mile just being consistent for one or the other. Whatever the number is, if the staff or the commission feels like a 1/2 mile is right, or 1/4 mile for both. I mean, I think a 1/2 feels better. I just have a question for staff on in the proposed standards document. I'm going to split it into 2 parts, but they may be the same answer. So I'll ask it as separate questions, but you may find them to be the same. On page 1 in the security plan, it talks about that the applicant must submit a fire safety plan approved by the chief. So we've got that. And then there's the building and site requirements. There's 3 different bullets about building code and parking and lighting. And so this is why I think they might be the same, but they might be different. We're talking about making this a potential use in hotel housing or in hotel facilities. Do not hotel facilities already have to meet those standards? And is there a reason we would trigger them to have their standards re-looked at versus if they had just continued on in business, they would be subject to whatever inspections there's. I guess those specific things to me feel like something that they should have met anyways when they were in the hotel business.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman, I think you're right. I think the practical matter is that existing facilities anyway would meet those, or a lot of them would meet those. It may be, but I think what we're trying to do is make sure that we are being clear about, some of the characteristics of the sites that would host this sort of a facility. I don't think that they're that we think that they pose any barriers.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Roman. So in terms of sprinklering and exiting, you're correct that that's probably, especially in a hotel situation, already addressed. The concern would be more with locking certain doors. Could be that you have a very different approach with temporary pandemic response housing than you might with a hotel in terms of how you lock your doors. And that would be something very important to review from a fire safety standpoint. So that at least is one of the issues that we were thinking of.
That makes sense. What I just don't want us to do is have it be that it's so onerous that a facility would choose not to do it because it's essentially like getting permitted all over again. So I hear what you're saying, and I think those things that are unique nuances to this type of use make sense. But I think I would caution us of making it too broad that it kind of comes back to what you had to do in the first place to get passed through. So that's my only feedback. Otherwise, I think these are really good.
Commissioner Roman, is your concern there more about if a facility is 25 years old and building standards have changed, that they have to bring them up to current standards?
That is my thing, or that the Solberg Suites wants to do this, but yeah, they're in compliant with the standards of the time. But this calls for them to have to do 12 things that they wouldn't otherwise have to do if they were still in business. And maybe this 6 months of this income keeps them going and they continue to be an important part of our city versus a vacant property. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we're understanding that from the same side and what Julie said. Are we understanding that, or are we saying no with this, the way that language is written, that they would have to, I don't know, replace all their plugins and add no drip faucets or something? Just trying to understand where that falls into place.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, that's definitely not the intent to kind of leverage all kinds of other improvements, but rather to address immediate health safety issues.
Okay. Thoughts on that? Go ahead.
I think it makes sense. I just want to back to the conversation we had before. I don't want to have something that opens a door to a number of the public being able to file a complaint that, according to the wording of our code, that they are non-compliant and that they would be shut down or whatever. So that's all.
Okay. Any other questions on? I think we're still on standards. Is that correct, Julie?
Yep. And so far, what I'm hearing is with regard to locational criteria, that folks feel that the half mile is a good distance, and you like the fact that having it be half mile from transit and a half mile from grocery. Keep the distance criteria the same.
Yeah, I think consistency was definitely. I don't know. We only heard from a couple commissioners on the distance. Is there? Are there more thoughts on that, Commissioner Cookton?
I'm fine with half mile, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right, that's three. I think three of us so far. If we get one more, then we're over half that agree to the half mile.
Half a mile is good too.
Okay. And Commissioner Albrecht?
I was just going to agree as well.
Oh, okay. All right. So yes, you do have some consensus on that.
Okay. So back to the question. So that's essentially, I guess, to flesh out this. You seem okay with the standards as presented, with the change that we just noted about the half mile distance. Was there any other standards that you think should be added that you don't see on the draft?
I'm looking through mine right now as well. So Commissioner Roman?
Yeah, the only one, and maybe I'm missing it again here, but one of the things we talked about was density of use. And maybe that's going to show up later in the draft. But not wanting we wanted these somewhat dispersed and not having 4, 5, 6 of them in the same cluster. Did I miss that in here?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman, no, that's not actually included in here, the spacing distance that we were talking about.
Okay, I don't know what the body's consensus is, but it would be good to have something. I seem to recall that was one of the pieces that was talked about last time, was some sort of spacing distance. Whether that was number of total beds or distance between facilities, I don't recall, but I do remember there was some talk about that, and I'll be curious to know what others think.
Commissioner Cookton?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, to that point, I too like the idea of some spacing. I think we've got to be a little careful if we've got 7 hotels or whatever the number is that are currently doing that. I'd hate to have some sort of a spacing requirement, and then it's a race to see who can get their application in first and somebody gets squeezed out. And so I think we just want to make sure we're being careful about that.
Okay. Other commission members, and I do recall some of that discussion, and I think one of my comments was really more about the city making sure that we aren't concentrating this to adversely impact maybe some of our protected communities. Protected classes. So I don't know how to think about that right now, and maybe that's a little bit more for staff to think about. But I think you're hearing there's still some thought there about not making unfair burdens on any given population or location.
Okay.
Any other commission members' thoughts? Again, on standards or anything that's missing? Or Commissioner Cookton?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I don't have this thought fully baked in my head yet, but I'm a little torn on the proximity, because I think there's benefits to having this spread out and not concentrating it. But I, again, sort of have some struggles that, well, my neighbor did this before I was ready to do it, and now I can't because my neighbor is. And I feel that's a little unjust. So I don't know how we can be creative to avoid some of the unintended consequences of proximity or density or whatever.
That's a good point, Commissioner Cookton.
Something to think about, yeah.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Yeah, would agree with Commissioner Cookton. I also think that if we're specifically zeroing in on hotels tend to be near similar hotels and congregate near each other. So just because they're congregate near each other shouldn't preclude, one being used for this interim use and another being used for an interim use. I understand Chair Stolberg's response. Like I understand not concentrating and putting in an unnecessary burden, but I do think as an interim use, it seems like an effective thing to give to all hotel chains owners locations, despite what others are doing near and around them.
All right, thank you. No, it's a good point too, and I tend to forget about these as being an emergency use, short duration. I kind of veered off into long-term duration there again. Commissioner Abdi, did you have a comment?
Yes, and I feel conflicted, and I was the one that really was going in terms of the making sure that we are discussing concentration and how do we space out or how do we cap the number if we were to go for an interim use or whatever the case may be. With the new proposal that we're talking right now, I feel like there is not even a time on it. I felt that the interim use folks had an understanding that that interim use application would expire 1 to 2 years, depending on whatever the number ends up being. But with this proposal, it's subject to the governor lifting the ban or lifting the or ending the whatchamacallit?
The emergency order.
Emergency. Thank you. So because it's an unknown timeline, I would assume or I would think that neighbors or facilities that have high concentration, excuse me, if we allow more concentration and the use does not end in a timeline that folks would have liked to, and the emergency continues to go on and drag on, the concentration obviously brings in, has a certain, I don't want to say a dislike, but, my only concern for the sake of clarity is the proposed timeline is not a specific timeline, and concentration would concentrate this use instead of having it encouraging folks to disperse. And I know the emergency is not for the sake of hotels. I'm assuming, are we here to save hotels and to make sure that they stay in business for this emergency? Or are we talking about this emergency for the sake of making sure families in Bloomington are housed during this pandemic? So I feel like we are going to have to, I'm going to end with that. I am conflicted with the concentration option, with the concern that the pandemic is subject to the governor's ending the emergency. And if there is not a specific site for what that number is, I would like it to be more dispersed to ensure that there is not a burden on surrounding uses.
Okay. All right. Commissioner Albrecht?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Commissioner Abdi on that. However, I do think that the timeline coinciding with the emergency orders makes a lot of sense in that, I do think there is, for this pandemic's sake, as an example, I think the governor generally has an incentive to not extend the emergency powers again and again and again for an unreasonable amount of time, right? I don't think that the governor is going to extend emergency powers into 2020 without having a very good reason and a really high need to do so. So I do believe that timeline allows for flexibility in that it could be more than 1 or even 2 years if that is absolutely necessary, but it also could be shorter and a transition plan could be put in place in which that could be transitioned away from from that interim use. That's just my thought on that timeline.
Okay. Other commissioners thoughts on this? I think there's it feels like half dozen of one and 6 of the other right now for staff. So trying to give them some thoughts. Commissioner Roman?
I don't have a strong opinion on the topic. I just raised it because I recalled it was discussed and I didn't see anything in there. So I would look for staff's guidance on, based on either what they've seen, what they've heard from other colleagues in other communities, or what they've heard from the community, and make a recommendation there. So I don't feel strongly one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. Others? I think Commissioner Roman, to your point, I think we were looking more just to make sure that we're thinking about this holistically. And I would trust that staff has, and I know they have thought about this an awful lot, and will be able to provide additional guidance if needed for the city council on any kind of density or whatever issues may be. Commissioner Corman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm in the same spot. I don't have a specific preference, and I prefer to trust the recommendation of the staff based on their knowledge and experience in this.
Okay. Are you getting a direction, Ms. Barnum?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. So again, just to summarize, in terms of locational standards, half mile for both. You're generally okay with the rest of the standards. You want staff to think about if there is any way to provide some means to eliminate concentrations of these in the set of standards. So we can certainly take a look at that.
Ms. Barnum, I think there was maybe some indifference to that after all was said and done.
Okay.
In part, quite honestly, we're not the experts in it, so we don't know if it's better to be concentrated or not to be. So we would look to staff to develop that if it is one or the other at this point.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. And so with that, I guess I will kind of move forward to, there's some outreach here. Our typical, our standard slide here. Just to let you know, we did send the Planning Commission packet out to various shelter providers, just so you know that. You also, I believe, received an email that we got today with a letter from St. Stephen's Human Services.
We did.
And so, and they had some comments on some of the standards as well. So next steps, given your preference to move forward with the emergency approach, would be to finalize the draft resolution. We'll be doing some outreach, again, to the existing providers, Convention Visitor Bureau, hotels, et cetera, and then getting this on a city council agenda as soon as we can in January for consideration, and then, putting it into place. So that's kind of what the timeline looks like moving forward. And I believe that is the end of the presentation. So unless you have any other questions, I think that concludes this item.
All right. Commissioner Cookton, do you have a question?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just to clarify, will this come before the Planning Commission again?
No, this is a resolution that would go directly to the council. We can certainly provide you a copy of that resolution.
Okay. Ms. Barnum, I think it would be helpful as we've Planning Commission to see what that resolution is as a email or information item, as we've asked for other items in the past.
We can do that.
Thank you. All right. Commissioner Roman?
Thank you. Yeah, I would second that, even if it's just I mean, I know we all can have access to the public docket for the council, but even if it's just a heads up that this is what we're sending to the council,
Sure.
we can either offer you feedback or feedback to the council.
We will do that.
But thank you for your work on this. This is excellent.
Yeah, well, thank you for your input.
Yes, second the thank you. It's a lot of work under, I think, a lot of duress as you had an application in front of you and then dropping, and then the council or the planning commission giving you some good direction at some points and maybe some very confusing direction at other points. So thank you very much for working on this.
You're very welcome.
All right. I think that concludes item number 1. Looks like item number 2 is discussion of the 2021 Planning Commission work plan. And I believe Julie Long, you're presenting on this as well as Julie Farnham?
Yes, that is correct. I'll be doing the bulk of the presentation, and Julie Long is here to go over the transportation and transit pieces of that. So
Okay.
just want to get this slideshow up. And are you all seeing that?
No,
slide.
not yet.
Oh, I need to share the screen. Okay. Can you see it now?
It's up with the slides on the side, so just go
All right.
to presentation mode.
There we go. Okay, so the 2021 Planning Commission work plan. So just a quick overview of the things that you accomplished in 2020. So it was a busy year, got a lot done. Also wanted to just do an update on the planning division staff structure. So probably the big change here this year is there was a long-range planner position that was vacated back in 2009 and was never filled, but remained an option. During this budgeting season, which was, as you know, a little more challenging than some in the past, that position was actually given up. And in order to help with the budget balancing process. Another thing that happened is that we are dedicating 20% of one of the long-range planning staff to the HRA. And so essentially that's Mike Palermo, who has done a lot of work with housing, some of the housing efforts here already. So that was a natural fit for him. But the result of that is that we have about 400 hours less than we normally have to play with from long-range planning staff. So one of the other big stories here of 2020 was that there was a large number of carryover projects. Some were big projects that we did not ever think we would get done in 2020. Others were projects that got kind of put on the back burner because there was a couple projects that came up, including the one that we just talked about, and the other being the self-storage facility. Both of those were, you know, much shorter time frame priorities, and they pretty much bumped out a couple other projects or backburnered some of those projects. The good news is there was a fair amount of progress made on some of these projects, even if we didn't take them to close in 2020. So I'll be kind of going through all of the projects, and these are the buckets that we put them into. And one of the new ones that we added this year was this transportation and transit updates. There was a request by the Planning Commission chair that, we could do a better job of keeping the Planning Commission abreast of transportation and transit projects. So that's what Julie Long will be speaking to later. And we've just added that into our work plan as an aside. So I'm going to go through kind of quickly each of these projects. And I guess this is a study session. If you have a question, maybe just stop me as I'm going along. This arrow icon up in the corner represents a carryover project. So we just talked about this, the temporary pandemic response housing. So, and we know that we're going to move forward with this resolution. So, so this going to Planning Commission with an ordinance on the 14th is no longer the case. One of the projects that was on our 2020 and got quite a bit of work done, almost actually got it completed when it got backburnered, was this codifying of the environmental review process. So what this is the mandatory environmental review process for EAWs or EISs. There's thresholds that get triggered depending on the size and the type of use. And what the reason behind this project was to include language in our code to clarify what the process is and when those mandatory reviews are required for a couple of reasons. One, so that it's in front of staff, so that it's on their radar, and it's also on the radar of applicants and folks wanting to do development in the city. So this is nearing completion, so hoping to get this finalized and in front of the Planning Commission in the first quarter of the year. The sign ordinance is a big project. We did not anticipate we would be able to finish that in 2020. Did get some good work done on it early on in the year, and then this one got sidetracked. One of the things, kind of where we're at with this is we're about ready to do some outreach. And given the complexity and just the sensitivity of sign regulation, we really want to do outreach when we can do it face to face. And so we're looking at this probably getting going more on this in the last half of 2021. And this will very likely carry over into 2022 just because it's a complicated piece of our ordinance. This update the landscape and tree preservation standards. This kind of is related to some of the other sustainability projects that we have on our list, and those other ones took precedent over this, and we decided to let's really define this more clearly and more narrowly, and just get this part of it done, because it was getting into sort of wholesale looking at our landscaping and tree preservation regulations. This project is not that. This project is really looking at our current codes. It's really kind of like the miscellaneous issues or the cleanup code of some of the existing stuff. We're going to be looking at broader sustainability standards and best practices as a separate project here. And so that may trigger some additional changes to these other standards. But the idea is that we want to get rid of any current kind of low-hanging barriers to doing sustainable best practices through our current landscaping tree preservation requirements. The self-storage study, you reviewed this back in October. The City Council just reviewed it on Monday. The City Council did recommend going with staff's recommendations on this. Planning Commission had some slightly different recommendations. So we will be moving forward. First off, we're going to be doing some outreach to affected property owners and the storage business owners, and then drafting up the ordinance and getting that through the public hearings. We anticipate that in the late Q1, early Q2 kind of time period. Energy benchmarking and time of sale disclosure requirements. This was one of those sustainability items that kind of took precedent over that landscaping standards that I just spoke about. So this is something that's being led by the sustainability staff that's housed in Public Works, and working with a consultant, and is really looking at various approaches to doing energy benchmarking and time of sale disclosure. This project got slowed down a little bit, and the pandemic and needing to go virtual had a slowing down effect on a lot of projects, particularly where you were trying to interact with other agencies and such. And this was one of those. So while we had hoped to have something ready to move forward with, so the idea is that the first part of this project, which is being led by Public Works, is to identify how to move forward with this. The second part of it is kind of where planning takes the ball and converts the direction into a code amendments. So it's my understanding that this is going to be going to City Council study in, I believe, February. And then once we get some direction, and I understand that they want to do some outreach before actually finalizing any kind of amendment. So we're looking at probably having some amendment work related to these things, maybe mid-year or late summer kind of thing. There's another sustainability related item. This actually is somewhat of a carryover because there was a work group that was established consisting of folks from other metro area cities and some outstate cities, some who are ahead of us in the process, and some who are kind of where we are in trying to come up with a policy and perhaps some actual standards. And so we've been meeting with this group, and the idea being coordinating amongst a group to share best practices and also to try to have consistent application of regulation and policies kind of across the area, so that one community isn't significantly more restrictive than the other. So that's kind of the idea behind it. Moving forward in 2021, we'll be continuing to work with some of the other communities in that group to perhaps draft a policy statement, and perhaps that will get translated into some standards depending on the direction that we get. This is a new project. There's several projects that have been suggested to planning staff that are related to housing and kind of coming out of the City Council's interest in expanding housing opportunities, particularly more affordable choices across the city. So as you may be aware, we do have provisions for accessory dwelling units in our code now. We haven't really had many accessory dwelling units be built under those standards. And so what this would be is taking a look at our standards, maybe comparing to some other standards, and see if our standards should be tweaked in any way to perhaps align better with other community standards, and also to meet kind of where the current demand is. Our original standards were adopted, I believe, in 2008. So this whole business around ADUs and just the way they're designed and all of that has really advanced a lot. So I think it's worth looking at and updating our standards, just given current best practices have changed. Here's another housing related one, and again, kind of related to the affordability and affordable choices, particularly with regard to the lower density, so single family, two family. So looking at standards like lot sizes, lot widths, and such. Another housing one is looking at our multifamily parking standards. So as you have, I'm sure, noticed in review of some of these residential development projects that have come before you, parking flexibility is one of is often requested, particularly when a developer is trying to do affordable housing, just because the cost of providing parking, in particular structured parking, is really expensive. So this project would involve just kind of doing a survey of other communities as well, seeing where we stand, and you know, considering if our parking standards should be modified in any way. And our annual miscellaneous issues ordinance, which you just reviewed a month ago, and so we always have that on our plate. And in 2021, we have no city initialized rezonings or reguidings on our plate so far. So that's a new thing for us, but you never know what could come down the pike. So moving on to the category of plans and special projects, the Parks Master Plan update, this was started actually back in late 2019. And it too was slowed down a lot by just the conversion to online, everything being online. But the plan is to get this wrapped up by mid-year in 2021, and planning has just been providing some kind of oversight and review assistance on this project. The Lindale retrofit strategy, which I know we've given you some updates on that, and our initial plan was to have this done by the end of 2020, but here again ran into, particularly didn't want to entangle this project and review of the final draft with all of the budget and all the other things that were going on at the end of the year here. So we extended this project out, and our plan is to bring it back to you for a study session in January 21st. And it'll also go to council, and then we'll finalize it, and it'll come back for public hearings probably in March. The Congress for New Urbanism, if you might recall, in 2020, they were going to have their national conference in the Twin Cities. And as part of that, they always try to do some community projects. It's kind of almost like a pro bono kind of thing. They match up communities with a national design consultant. And it's a application-based kind of thing. And we submitted an application with Richfield, and we were selected. And we were all set to, this is essentially, it's kind of a quick and dirty design process, and there's a design charrette that happens, and that's kind of the culmination of this. And we were all set to have that design charrette in March, and the plug got pulled on that. So our hope is that we will be able to hold some sort of virtual input sessions in the spring, and we can just wrap up this project. The consultant has done a fair amount of existing conditions and sort of issues and opportunities identification. Again, this is sort of a very high level. It's not a detailed plan for construction or anything like that. It's really some high level ideas on how to improve this area. So along with the use of the hotels as shelters, as you've also seen in like the Rosa development and some other projects that have come before you, we're seeing some interest in some reuse or conversion of hotels to other uses, primarily residential use. So this project would be taking a more holistic look at that and providing some direction on and perhaps identifying some areas that maybe seem more ripe for that conversion. A few years back, 2017, I believe, the HRA with planning assistance did a study of the neighborhood commercial nodes, the older neighborhood commercial nodes throughout the city, and prioritized them. The idea behind the project was really to help the HRA make decisions about their funding of projects. And given changes, again, some of it brought on by the pandemic, but just changes in retail and everything else, we thought it was a good idea to maybe take another look at, revisit those priorities and see if anything should be changed or reprioritized. So that's what this project would involve. This is a project that's been kind of around, but hasn't gotten any traction so far. In part, we had it also, this should be a carryover, but we had this on our 2020, but nothing happened, in large part because our public health folks were preoccupied and are continue to be preoccupied with the pandemic. So this kind of fell to the wayside. But this fall, later this, just recently, there was a staff work group that was convened. So staff from across the city organization to start looking at kind of a health lens to our policies and our actions. And so moving forward into the next year, I guess, that'll be, planning staff will participate with that group. At this point, it's unclear, what might come out of that, but what could come out of that are some code amendments, again, to remove barriers or to make sure that we're addressing kind of healthy community issues appropriately in our codes. Another recurring project is the South Loop Alternative Urban Area-Wide Review. This is a type of environmental review. It's not a mandatory environmental review, it's an alternative environmental review. What this allows is in a area where there's a lot of development that could be subject to mandatory EAWs, this alternative is provided for you to do a kind of comprehensive environmental review of multiple projects. And so that's what this is. So you can see those parcels there are the ones that are kind of the key redevelopment sites that are forecast to have projects that could be big enough to trigger an EAW. So those are part of the redevelopment scenario, which is described in the AUAR, and then the AUAR looks at the environmental impacts if all of that development comes to fruition. And in order to keep the AUAR as a valid document, meaning with the AUR in place, any project that comes in here that's covered in this redevelopment scenario essentially would not have to do a separate EAW or EIS, provided the proposed development is equal to or less than what was studied in this redevelopment scenario in the AUAR. So the redevelopment scenario in the AUAR kind of anticipates what we believe is the maximum amount of build-out development. At any rate, in order for this to remain valid, it has to be updated every 5 years. It was last approved in the spring of 2017, so it'll need to be approved in the spring of 2022. So we need to start kind of doing some of the background teeing up of the work and trying to identify if we need to get any consultants to do, say, traffic studies or utility studies to use them as updates so that we can be ready to hit the ground running in early 2022 to get this done. We've got several ongoing initiatives. So housing initiatives are one. We've got the OHO, the Opportunity Housing Ordinance, and updates to that. There's data tracking on affordable housing units, on NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing initiatives. There is the Bloomington Housing Action Team, the BHAT, and planning staff has been involved in those meetings with them, where they meet every other month. And then there's various outreach activities around housing. We also are involved there's an internal engagement facilitation groups. And recently this fall, there was racial equity action teams were created again across the city, and community development each department has its own internal team. And there's a couple of planners involved in that effort. And this is the list of some potential transportation transit initiatives, and I will turn it over now to Julie Long, who can speak to these projects.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Planning Commission, for having us tonight. We appreciate Chair Solberg's invitation to expand our transportation and transit items with Planning Commission. In the past, we had TTAC. And when that disbanded, those roles went to Planning Commission, and I will admit we have not done a really great job in keeping you all up to date on various issues. So here is our attempt at 2021. So one of the things we want to do is to develop a strategic transportation plan. Now, we understand that we won't be able to fully flesh this document out in 2021, and it will extend into 2022, but we want to start to look at review of peer community approaches to transportation planning. That's an area where engineering feels we could expand and do better in the future. We want to talk about a conversation on how to integrate all the various different safety, equity, sustainability, public health into transportation planning. Talk about funding, policy guidance, and how we start to prioritize our projects. We also want to look at bikes and peds, and the project we have scoped out is the 35W parallel bike route. As you're aware, the 35W bridge over the Minnesota River was recently constructed, and the Orange Line tunnel under 494 is currently under construction right now. Well, it would be a great asset for Bloomington to have a bike facility that connected those two nodes. And we thought it would serve our community well. So we want to look at how best to do that and what options, routes would go through the community. We also have a couple of different transit projects. With the Orange Line, there's going to be a connecting bus study. And we're going to want some input from you on how the routes will change with Metro Transit here in Bloomington and how best to serve our residents and the users of the transit system. And then we also wanted to provide a couple updates on Network Next, is what Metro Transit calls their arterial BRT study. And then the Riverview Corridor, which comes from Ramsey County into the South Loop in Bloomington. So we wanted to provide updates on that. We also have a couple different street layout things coming your way. You'll see the Lyndale and 86 intersection and the American Boulevard and Normandale Lake District probably early on in 2021. With our pavement management program projects, those are two areas that are included for construction in 2021, and we want to look at improving those and see if we can make more better connections. For instance, on the Lyndale and 86 intersection, probably 3 years ago, we had a pavement management project over there, and we made some improvements for bike connection to that intersection. But then as you cross the signal, it just drops off, and where do you go? So we want to look at that and get some input from you on that. We also will be looking at the intersection of Old Cedar and Old Shakopee. That's a high volume intersection with a skew that is a bit of a challenge, and we want to talk about that. And then one of the things we're interested in hearing from you later is on our regional issues. What types of projects do you want to hear from us about on the regional transportation system? Well, there are a number of different studies going on, whether it's the Corridors of Commerce 494 study or the Trunk Highway 77 study. And we just are happy to provide you input, and we want to provide you the right amount of input at the right time. So we'd be interested in hearing your opinion on that. And I'll turn it back over to Julie.
Thanks, Julie. I guess before we move on, does anybody have any comments specific to the transportation discussion here with Julie?
So this is Chair Solberg, and I'd just like to thank you, Julie, for bringing this forward to us. I certainly have a lot of interest in this from my position at work, but additionally because of that strong connection between land use and transportation, and a lot of the questions that you're asking in the strategic transportation plan are a lot of the things that we're considering here when these land use decisions are coming before us. So I really look forward to being able to work with Public Works on this. If I were to just add one other thing, one of the areas I'd like to, and I don't know how to necessarily frame this, is think about, and it has to do as much with your strategic plan as anything, but thinking about our pavement plan, and when we reconstruct streets, where are opportunities to advance sustainability, reduce pavement, advance health by increasing sidewalks, those sorts of things. And maybe that's in the larger strategic plan rather than specifics on street layouts, but I'll leave that to you to think about. So my comments, I don't know if anybody else has anything.
Okay, if not, I will continue on. So this is our list of potential future projects, and several of these have been on the docket for a while. We just haven't gotten to them yet. They just haven't, other things have been priorities. We've got the 98th Street Corridor Interchange Study, and that again would be us assisting Public Works who would lead that. And that was one that kind of came out of the 98th Street Station Area Plan. And that I believe is tentatively scheduled in terms of budgeted for in 2023. So, you know, that's kind of where that is at this point in time. Temporary structure standards, updating legal sections in the code, rezone the remaining of 494, restructuring the zoning code, moving from chapter 19 to chapter 21. This has been a decade-long project, and every time we do a code amendment, we move a little closer to this. So this project keeps getting smaller, which is good, but we just haven't actually just tackled the whole thing. We've been doing it by other projects. Food trucks. So you saw these this last year, and this was one that it needs. I believe the Planning Commission held a public hearing on this and forwarded on to City Council, who then tabled it indefinitely, in part again because with the pandemic and the closure of restaurants, et cetera, it just didn't seem like a good time to be moving forward with this food truck item. So that was one that got delayed indefinitely by the City Council. It's similar to the short-term rental, same kind of thing. I know you provided some input in 2020 on that, and Council directed us to kind of put that on hold for the time being. Reviewing swimming pool standards. This came up earlier in the summer season with one of the things with the pandemic was that everybody was staying home and they all wanted swimming pools. So we had a huge influx of permits for swimming pools, and some issues with the standards were revealed, and so there was some interest in let's take a look at that. That has since cooled off. Anyway, it's on our future. We kept it on our future list. We didn't include it on 2021 because the other things seem to be a higher priority. But you can weigh in on that. Another project too, where Parks is identified, is taking a look at trail connections. The city has a number of trailheads on city property along the bluff, essentially. And once the state trail is in, improving those trail connections and the trailheads that are located in the neighborhoods. This is hard to read a little bit, a graphic of how we see things in time. And of course, this is a bit of a fantasy football kind of a thing, but most of the stuff in green, all the stuff in green, is carryover. So most of that is scheduled to be happening at the beginning of the year, the first half of the year. The key or the main exception to that is the sign ordinance, which I mentioned before, because we want to do some outreach. We're going to kind of get through some of these other things first and then focus on that sign ordinance, pick that back up mid-year and going into 2022. So these are just some, guesstimates of where some of these new projects in blue. We've also included some of these other potential projects that I mentioned just recently on this graphic as well. We put those in future, but they're showing up on this in case you direct us to change the priority of anything. So with that, it brings us to the questions, and which is, should any of the projects be moved from 2021 delayed to 2022, or should any of the 2022 projects be moved up to 2021? I guess I'll just read through all of these because you can probably talk about them simultaneously. Are there any other projects that you think we should move forward that aren't described here? And then again, on the priority, if there's any projects that should be reprioritized, depending on how much time is anticipated associated with that project, it might mean delaying one of the projects that's as proposed as a higher priority. So with that, I'm gonna, let's see. I don't know which is the best graphic for you to look at. Maybe
we'll
this
probably
one.
have to go back and forth, I'm guessing, a little bit.
Sure.
Just in these, potentially depending upon Planning Commission members' thoughts. So I just like to say a thought just regarding one of the future studies that or processes that was out there. I think it was the next slide. And just thinking from the parks lead that the Mississippi River Trail connections, I've just been blown away by the amount of usage on the new trail, despite how maybe contentious it was to build it. When I was down there a couple weeks ago and basically was at the point of parking, more than halfway up the hill to get down to the trail, it just kind of hit on me that I think the city really needs to think about that next phase and next connections, probably sooner rather than later. But that's just some thoughts on that. That doesn't mean it jumps into the priority queue at this point. But
Mr. Chair, I would just point out that this is a parks-led project, and they have it scheduled in their CIP. They're budgeting for it for 2023. So that's, we've got it on here because just so that it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. Because we will be playing a role in that project, but we're not driving it, so it's right. Dependent on their budget.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Maybe go back to the other one and the priorities that staff has laid out. So I would agree on the CNU legacy project, and in part, I think that's a priority because of the, I guess, the work that the state is doing right now on 494 with that corridors of commerce potential project, and the redevelopment. I think we trying to look for where that's. The update on the commercial redevelopment priorities. So I think those are still good and should remain on here as well. I don't have any distinct thoughts about any of the others unless other planning commissioners, Commissioner Cookton.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The one that stuck out to me was the review of the multifamily parking standards. I'm happy to see that at the top of the blue category there. I think that's something we repeatedly hear as a planning commission that is could be improved upon by our applicants are telling us that, and I think there's real consequences there. If we can reduce those standards, I think that's a win-win for everybody. And so that for me is a top priority in the blue category.
Okay. Other thoughts from other commission members? Commissioner Roman?
I don't have any specific thoughts. I think it's a full agenda, and hopefully that there are not major things that come up that derail you from your from your goals. But no, I don't have any thoughts one way or the other on this. And if that's the priority that the staff is seeing for these things, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay. I guess trying to read through this, it's for consideration, Ms. Farnham, is that that there's more in the schedule that you can fit, or is that really for maybe replacement of some of the others? Can you allude on what that, I don't know, salmon color is?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I apologize. That is a little bit confusing. In fact, I might have taken that off on another version. I might have added the wrong version into this because the salmon colored pieces are slated for future. They are not covered in the hours estimate that we have available. So only the green, blue, and white at the bottom, the ongoing stuff at the bottom, is all of that is covered in the estimate of hours that we have available. The orange ones are, those were ones, well, two of them that were kind of carryovers, and then there's a couple other ones. But if you felt like those should be a higher priority than any of, say, the blue ones, we can shuffle things around a little bit, and we'll just have to look at those hours. So if you wanted to move one from salmon to blue, we'd have to take a blue one and move it down to salmon.
Commissioner Roman?
Yeah, I guess, Julie, is there a lot of work left to do on food trucks, or is it just that there were considerations for waiting at the council level that may not be considerations anymore? And in other words, is it anything have to be really redone, or is it just a matter of taking where we're at and bringing it to the council for their final approval? Because I could see where if things are better enough by the summer, that could be a thing.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman. Yeah, the draft is pretty well in place. And in fact, I believe there was a public hearing held before the Planning Commission, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, there was.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. So it was forwarded to the City Council, but the City Council tabled it indefinitely. So if there is some air and it looks like there's an opening and some appetite to move this forward, it could be moved forward fairly quickly. It's not a big hours kind of thing.
Great.
Okay. I'm not seeing, for commission members, I'm not seeing anything offhand in the salmon that would move up, say, ahead of hotel conversion study or accessory dwelling units. And again, I think the food truck is an opportunity if it becomes available. And I trust staff has prioritized this with some look at risk and reward on looking at those. So I can support this work plan moving forward. Other commission members? Can we have a yay or a nay on the work plan? Commissioner Albrecht?
I agree. I think it looks great and very, very good work by the staff. Thanks for bringing this forward. And I think that this makes a lot of sense. And like Commissioner Roman said, I hope you achieve the goal here.
There we go.
And Mr. Chairman, this is one we would look for a formal motion on. I don't know if there's a motion slide, but.
Motion to approve the 2021 Planning Commission work plan. Simple enough.
Correct.
Yep. All right. Commission members, is there a motion? Commissioner Albrecht?
I move to approve the 2021 Planning Commission work plan.
All right. Is there a second? Commissioner Abdi?
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second to recommend approval of the 2021 Planning Commission work plan. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Corman.
Aye.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. All right. Thank you, staff, for putting that together.
Yeah, and I believe we've got this slated for the February 1st council meeting. So we'll get this finalized, but that won't stop us from getting going on some of those items that we're already working on. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your work on that. All right. Item number 3, review and approve the 2021 Planning Commission meeting calendar. Mr. Markegard.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, quick item here, which is your 2021 schedule. Grant, I'm having a little difficulty on the graphics. I think it's because we have 2 screens going.
I need to unshare.
No, that's okay, but we can utilize this view, I guess. So what we look at in the schedule.
I think we're still seeing the old or the previous one. Are you guys seeing the calendar next to the description, or are you just seeing the 2021 Planning Commission schedule for Commission?
2021 Planning Commission.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Mr. Parker, do you have any advice on how to get the second screen showing? Just a second, he's doing some changes.
All right, perfect. I'll just say thank you to the other Planning Commission members for indulging my transportation desires within the commission.
Yeah, let's see. While he's working on that, with the schedule, the biggest thing we're looking at is how items track between the Planning Commission and the Council. Because you could imagine a schedule that's always the first and third, or always is the second and fourth Thursday of the month. But because the council meetings fluctuate so much, we try to get the Planning Commission scheduled to match very well, and that is the 11-day time period is ideal, given that we're on Planning Commission Thursdays and Council's on Mondays. A couple other things we always look to do are having 2 regular meetings a month and then 1 study meeting a month, except when we have the APA conference. This year that would be in May, however, it is remote this year. And then in November and December, just given the holidays. And then, as always, we try to avoid holidays in general and the various conferences, state and national APA. ULI, I don't think has been, no, it has been scheduled. The state conference has not been scheduled. And then we try to avoid the MEA week in October as well, just because there's typically a lot of conflicts with planning commissioners that week. So that's how we came to the proposal. So tonight we're just looking for any input you might have.
Sure.
And motion to either adopt or modify.
All right. And I know last year we moved a meeting because of conflict, and I did check, and I believe I was checking in the March timeframe for spring break, or maybe it was April. Now I don't even remember, but thought that was clear, but I'm sure there's others. There might be somebody else that's influential in the school that might tell us when there's some conflicts. So, and commission members, are there, and I can't see them anymore, Mr. Markegard.
Yeah.
Commission members, are there any comments on the schedule? I'll give you a couple minutes again to look over that. If we see any glaring issues. Commissioner Cookton?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Question for staff, just as a general. I know we shoot for the 11-day thing. What is the historical precedence for having a 4-day turnaround on a particular item? I was just thinking about this pandemic housing issue we just spoke about on item number 1, where we're really trying to push things through. Does that ever happen, or how common is that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Cookton, extremely rare. We really try to avoid that because that means that the packet for the City Council goes out before the actual Planning Commission meeting, so there's no way to convey to the council what the recommendation is. You would have to do it verbally at the meeting. However, in a pinch, which we were under for a while there with the temporary pandemic housing, given that there was CARES Act funding at stake for the county that would have been lost. We hadn't moved at light speed, basically. We did the very rare approach of pre-advertising and having that 4-day turnaround between Planning Commission and Council. But that's the only time I ever remember doing that, and it would have to be a very special event.
And that would have been directed, was that directed by city leadership?
It was an internal city leadership decision to, given the funding implications and that basically the project would not have moved forward at the extended stay site unless we did that very rapid schedule.
Yeah, I'm not aware of ever doing that either. It's actually quite the opposite, usually, it feels like. Any other questions, Commissioner Cookton? Anybody else with comments on the calendar? Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion to approve or the 2021 Planning Commission calendar or as revised. Commissioner Roman.
Move to adopt the calendar as presented.
All right, we have a motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Corman?
Second.
All right, we have a motion to approve and a second the 2021 Planning Commission meeting calendar. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Corman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht,
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi,
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton,
Aye.
and I for myself. Motion passes. The calendar is approved, or recommended as approved, for 2021. All right. Mr. Markgard, is there anything else?
Commissioners, nothing else. I want to thank you for an excellent 2020. It's been a different year and a very busy year. And I'm glad we had WebEx as an alternative given our situation. Look forward to 2021. And I just want to wish everybody happy holidays.
All right. Commissioner Roman, did you have something?
Nope, sorry.
Oh.
Well, I will note that this is time of year where we usually gather as a commission, and look forward to doing that hopefully in the middle of the year.
Yes, let's celebrate Christmas or whatever holidays in July. And I'd like to thank staff for all the work that you guys have done over the past, is this now 15?
16 or 17.
16
I'd
or
have to look
17
back.
online meetings, how you pulled that together, as successful as it's been, ensuring that we had public input in all these issues, that we were able to have, for considering how quickly it took place, the very limited amount of technical issues, staff has been top-notch. I'd like to thank folks in the back room for all their work in helping us through this. And with that, I'd like to conclude the December 17th, 2020 study session. And just remind planning commissioners, our next meeting is January 14th of next year. Thank you.
Happy holidays.